Okay. And before we move into the main bulk of the presentation, we can sort of talk about the schedule a little bit. So we are over halfway through the Lunch and Learn presentations now. So we're on procurement right now. We'll have environmental review next month, and then we'll be discussing the application process to take part in grant funding through the city of Kalamazoo. That'll be the last of our Lunch and Learns for this year. That'll be in June. The last for this year, I should say, and we do plan on potentially having more in the future, especially if we get good feedback on these from all of you. So just let us know if these are of value, and we're happy to continue to plan and do these going forward. We've talked about this in previous presentations before, but the real point of these presentations is to try and make the somewhat muddy world of federal funding a little bit more accessible to especially smaller nonprofits that are interested in this type of work. Um, so if you think there's more topics that you would like clarification on, or even things that you'd like us to maybe get into in more detail, all of that could be very helpful to give us feedback on. I'd say when we're developing these, that's one of the things we talk about most often is like how deep into the material do we really want to go for something that is meant for a wider audience as more of a fundamental series. So we don't want to scare anyone off, but we also want to provide the information that would be most valuable to you all. So with that in mind, we'll sort of start it off with this procurement presentation. Anyone else that is showing up, they can sort of trickle in and see the recording later if they need to know all of this backstory. So anyways, for procurement today, there's 3 items on the agenda. There's what is procurement. We'll talk about procurement thresholds and then general procurement standards. I will present these first 2 bullets, the what is procurement and procurement thresholds, and then Ellie, our grants finance specialist, who you might remember from a previous HUD fundamentals module, will be coming back to explain general procurement standards. All right, so what is procurement? Procurement is really about purchasing using federal funds. So what we're talking about here is the means in which we use the funds to purchase goods and why it matters, the way that we do it. So procurement is defined as an entity's purchasing procedures, and all procurement needs to be fair. It needs to be open and well documented. So if you're sort of reading along here, this means that you should make sure that you're assuring market price or better, you're following specific written procedures, and that you're getting the correct approvals for these purchases. So when we're sort of talking about uh, some of these bullets here, when we say appropriate responsible party as this 3rd bullet, that means the member of the organization that's been determined to have the authority to approve procurement. We'll sort of touch on this in more detail as we move along in the presentation. But when we're talking about appropriate responsible party, this is not necessarily the city. This is something in your organization structure that's showing that you're following the correct procurement guidelines. But like I said, we'll talk about more about that later. So moving forward, procurement thresholds. So procurement thresholds, there's basically 3, and this, depending on the amount of whatever it is you're purchasing, it will fall under one of these 3 bullets generally. And each of these 3 bullets has a different type of specification for how that purchasing needs to be done. So micro purchases is the first. Micro purchases are the smallest type of purchasing threshold. It shouldn't exceed 2,000 for construction and 10,000 for non-construction. It doesn't require competitive bidding, so you're still expected to shop around and find the most reasonable price when you're purchasing with micro purchases, but HUD does not expect you to solicit competitive quotations. Um, Micro purchases, they can be considered sort of everyday one-off purchases. So when we're talking about this, you could think of like office supplies, maybe small equipment or transportation costs. Um, if it's unclear to you if a purchase counts as a micro purchase, it's important to contact us first so you're following the correct procurement guidelines when you're making your purchase. Small purchases. So, small, slightly larger than micro, right? But in fact, actually, the thresholds are much larger, than what we saw with micro purchases. So for this would be 2,000 to 250,000 for construction, 10,000 to 250,000 for non-construction. That 250,000 ceiling threshold is the current simplified acquisition threshold established by the federal government. It isn't always that way, so if this is something you're watching recorded later, you should just keep in mind that this is something that is subject to change. In fact, actually, I apologize. It might be worth noting throughout this presentation in general that if your agreement has different standards for procurement inside of the agreement, like if you're a subrecipient with the city already, you should make sure that you're following those guidelines first and foremost. And whatever you're seeing here, don't switch your procurement standards unless something has been written in a new agreement that you're signing. So that's just a little side note. So, small purchases, these are preferred for simple and informal purchasing decisions. So, if you're thinking about what might fit into this, some examples might be labor contracts or recurring supplies that are over the micro purchase threshold, or even maybe some larger equipment. Generally, this is something that's been talked about in prior lunch and learns, but we don't encourage equipment purchases. However, this is something that's not banned outright by HUD. So if you're thinking like, oh, okay, there's equipment I want to purchase that's within these thresholds, that's something we would still want to talk about subrecipient to city to make sure that it's something you're prepared for taking on in the long run. Just another side note there. The for small purchases, competition is sought through at least 3 oral or written price quotations. Sealed bids are still the preferred method for construction, however. And I should also mention, if you're receiving oral bids, you will want to document it. So when it comes to documenting oral bids, you will want to, at the very least, make sure that you're taking down the date, who you spoke to, um, uh, and the bids you received around that, or in the bids you received around that time. Okay, large purchases. So these would be purchases greater than that simplified acquisition threshold, the 250,000. Um, this requires one of 3 procedures. So this would be a competitive sealed bid with formal advertisement, competitive proposals, or non-competitive proposals or sole source. We're going to go through each of those 3 and sort of talk about what they mean in these upcoming slides. It's just important for me to sort of reiterate here again. Purchases greater than 250,000, that counts as a large purchase right now because that is currently the simplified acquisition threshold, but that can change depending on guidance from the federal government. Large purchases, when you're thinking about what might qualify under this, those could be things like bulk construction materials or land acquisition. For the majority of you, especially if you're a small nonprofit that's looking to work with the city, you are likely never going to have to make a purchase that goes into this category. So it's not something you should be overly concerned about. If you're doing something like construction, that would be a different conversation. Um, all right, so let's sort of go through these 3 procedures here, starting with the competitive sealed bids. So competitive sealed bids are typically used for construction. The subrecipient can choose to select, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. You should make sure that you advertise for bid with these. So in IFB, you'll want to make sure that they're in an industry recognized publication. So it can't just be sort of an unknown, unclear publication. It may be like an example would maybe be something like your personal or your your private Facebook page or something like that. That's not considered an industry recognized publication for you to put your invitation for a bid out. Um, the invitation for bid, it must include complete and accurate specifications for the whatever it is that you're purchasing, and pertinent attachments and clearly defined items or services must be included as well. The contract has to be given to the lowest cost bidder who is one, most responsive, and two, most responsible. So responsive here, that would mean most in line with the bid requirements, and the most responsible would be the best fit for bid requirements. So you'll document everyone who sort of puts out for these bids, and the expectation is that you you select the one that fits these two pieces of criteria here. You don't just select based on some other criteria or basis that you as the subrecipient want. So um, you can choose to select none of the applicants if deemed necessary, and we'll sort of talk about that in more detail. But in those cases, you'll have to put out for bid again. We'll go into more details later. Okay. Competitive proposals. So these are typically used for professional services. Subrecipients should only use this method when conditions are not appropriate for the use of a sealed bid. In this case, you'll use a RFP, or request for proposal, and this should be publicized as well in an industry recognized publication. So an example of an industry recognized publication might be something like the Gazette, like a public news source. Every effort should be made to receive proposals from at least 3 qualified sources. All of that should be documented as well. We'll sort of hammer on this a couple of times throughout this presentation, but as much information about your procurement process that you can document, you should document, just to make sure that all your bases are covered. Okay, non-competitive sole source. So this is sort of the case where there's really only one option for you, and it really should only be utilized under very limited circumstances. Um, you'll you'll want to document why you received only one bid, and you'll have to do another bid. Like if you decide to not yeah, choose any of the bidders in your first put out for bid, you will have to do it again. The second bid should only it should account for possible reasons why the first bid only received one the first time around. You really should talk to us first before you go through this process, just so that we can be there and help ensure that you're documenting everything and doing everything the way that HUD would expect it, so that there's no hangups later on in your procurement process. Um, you'll want to show that another method of procurement wasn't possible for this. These are some of the reasons why, or these are the reasons you'll want to show one of these, that either the item or service was only available from a single source, a public emergency or condition did not permit the use of a competitive procurement. This one would be pretty rare. We talked about that too when we were talking about public emergencies in a previous module. It's not likely that we'll ever see a situation where this would be your reason for taking sole source. I mean, who knows? I'm not going to say never, but I wouldn't bet money on it. Right? So and then finally, competition was determined to be inadequate after soliciting proposals from multiple sources. And as you can probably surmise from some of these reasons, the documentation process could be tricky for this. So like, how do you necessarily document why the competition was inadequate after soliciting proposals from multiple sources? It can be done, and it's something that we would need to talk about together to make sure that you're doing it correctly and to the way that HUD, the federal government, would expect it. Okay, and local preference. So this is something that is important to sort of touch on as well. When you're looking for which bid to accept, it is generally discouraged to go with local preference. So that's not a sufficient reason to select one bidder over another, is that they're local, right? There are certain situations where local preference is permitted, and those would be in procuring architect or engineering services, but you can't um, use this criteria in order to narrow down your selection to an insufficiently small amount of qualified firms. So essentially, as long as you're using local preference and there's still a good amount of competition going on in your bidding process, then it is permitted for these architect or engineering services. Okay, and with that, I will pass the baton over. Oh, that was kind of cringy. I will pass it over to Ellie to handle general procurement standards. Thank you.
I muted myself, sorry. I was just saying thank you, Alex. And I think, as you mentioned, for anyone who is watching this who's a current subrecipient, please note that some of what you saw would be unfamiliar and new, and you might be thinking that's not what my agreement said. And that is true. And your current agreement, any existing agreements, the conditions of procurement will still prevail. This is the transition point now where we're moving into new procurement guidelines, which I think everybody will find a lot easier and give them a little more flexibility and make the procurement process slightly less burdensome for the majority of our subrecipients. And so now these general procurement standards are still just going to apply to everybody. The basic idea of procurement for the federal government is this idea of having full and open competition that provides for efficient and effective purchasing. And so the idea is, the reason that it's so hard to you know properly do a sole source purchase, a non-competitive purchase, is that the fundamental principle is that procurement should be free and open, right? Um, you need to have general procurement standards and policies in place, including a specific procurement conflict of interest policy, or a conflict of interest policy that specifically addresses procurement. And we'll get into that on a later slide. And then, as a general principle, you need to avoid the purchase of unnecessary or duplicative items, right? So it's about you are a steward of federal funds, of taxpayer funds, and that you're ensuring that the use of funds are necessary and appropriate. And along those lines, as was mentioned before, you are only allowed to award contracts to responsible contractors. So if you get a low bid from a contractor, like the lowest bid, if that contractor does not seem to be responsible, then you do not need to take, and you should not take that bid just because it's the lowest. You need to make sure to document why that contractor would not be considered a responsible bidder. But your first priority is to ensure that any funds expended are going to be expended by responsible people who are using the money and are going to protect the federal interest in those funds to get the services or the goods that are expected. Um, Contractors cannot, if you're doing sealed bids or any kind of competitive proposals, the contractors themselves cannot write the specifications. So if you were to get a consultant to help you write those bid specifications, they would be disallowed from then competing for that bid, right? That wouldn't be competitive. Uh, as we will continue to say in every training that we do, you must maintain the proper documentations and records regarding procurements. When in doubt, just save it, add it in there, throw in that email, because it's a lot easier to be able to find things to save things in the moment than to go a year later searching through your emails of where you found, like, here's where I got those quotes, here is where I was able to determine that this wasn't a responsible bidder, et cetera, et cetera. Just you will think past you when you just err on the side of documenting and saving everything. And then here, as Alex said, there are these different thresholds that would break up and give guidelines of what kind of procurement standards are required. You cannot artificially break up your procurement into smaller chunks so that you could qualify for a lower standard, right? So if you're doing a construction project and you've got to do um, electrical work all through a house and a rehab, and it's going to be about $12,000. And wouldn't it be nice to just be able to, well, I gave a bad example because we're doing construction. Let's say I'm going to shift that down. The micro purchase threshold for construction is $2,000. So let's say it's going to be $2,500. So you can't just say like, well, let me bid out, let me kind of split it up so that I get one purchase is doing this side of the house and one purchase is doing that side of the house, and the two of them together might equal to $3,500. But if I split them out, then I can make each one a micro purchase and I don't have to worry about getting competitive quotes, right? Not allowed. But the idea, is obviously like, would a reasonable person see this as, you kind of skirting around the rules? Along the lines of what it means to find a responsible contractor, every procurement needs to have a debarment check. So a debarment check is basically the federal government has a database of all the people who have ever, through certain federal procedures, been listed as debarred, ineligible, suspended from receiving federal funds. So these are people who, maybe they violated the EPA the Clear Water Act or something, and were found to be in violation, and they got a suspension for a certain period of time, or they're debarred forever from ever receiving federal funds. You have to do your due diligence of going to sam.gov, searching the entity that you're going to do a contract for. I will warn you, sam.gov is not the friendliest site to figure out how to do this initially, but basically you're going to go into the search, you're going to search through just entity, and you'll be able to click through and see if that person or that organization, that company is debarred. Um, and you'll see it kind of written there. And what you need to do is actually save a copy, print a copy of the website. So print it to PDF, print it to paper. So it shows the date at the top of the record that you're saving, the date that you ran it. You're going to sign it and date it yourself, either on a PDF, on the paper, and you're going to save this to show that you did this debarment check, because it's one thing to do it, it's another thing to do it and save it so that you can prove that you did it. If you did not save it, it doesn't count. Um, but again, this idea is that we're checking that these are not known entities that are already prohibited from receiving federal funds because of bad behavior in the past. So some of our subrecipients are going to potentially want to create a vendors list, basically a list of pre-qualified vendors or contractors, right? So that every time, this year that you're going to work with this contractor, you don't have to do a new debarment search, that you don't have to, evaluate fully all of their qualifications, that you can send out, if you're doing something like between the micro purchase threshold and the simplified acquisition threshold. If you're in that small purchase threshold and you just need to get several quotes, like it's great to have that list of vendors that you already know that you can rely on. If you want to do such a list, you need to, at least once a year, have an open solicitation period where you advertise that you are seeking vendors to join to be in your kind of roster of vendors. You need to allow entry of other firms to qualify at any time during that solicitation period. And you need to make sure that that list has an adequate number of qualified sources. So it can't be that your list just ends up with one person, because that's not a list. That's that you've now effectively said that all contracts are going to be with that person, right? So the thing is, like, you need to make sure it's current and needs to happen at least once a year. This isn't just that you get to do it once and forget it for the rest of your time, as much as that would be nice and convenient. We again need to have those principles of fair and open competition that apply. So subrecipients are expected to take affirmative steps to use small firms, minority-owned firms, and women-owned firms for HUD and federally financed activities. So affirmative steps include advertising and soliciting such businesses as potential sources. You'll actually see that the city of Kalamazoo, we do have online in our uh, it's like a site that forbids that if you search for the minority and women-owned businesses and City of Kalamazoo online, you can see that the City of Kalamazoo publicizes its list of all the organizations that have and companies that have registered as minority and women-owned businesses. So that's actually a great place to start to see what are some companies that you can reach out to affirmatively. This does not mean giving them any kind of preference in the actual uh, s- forgetting the term. This doesn't mean that you can give any kind of actual preference when selecting the contract, right? So you can make sure that you take the affirmative steps to include them so that they have a chance to compete. It does not give them any advantage in the actual competition. You are required to have a policy and procedure on what affirmative steps you're going to take in recruiting minority and women-owned businesses and giving them a chance to compete for the procurement. Section 3. So subrecipients are required to make reasonable efforts to award contracts for construction related work to businesses that provide economic opportunities to low and very low income persons that are located in or businesses that are owned by residents of the target area. We need to report any Section 3 efforts to HUD, which means that the city is also going to require reporting from you on your efforts. And this is going to be something that is depending on whether you're going to meet certain thresholds. So this will be something in your agreement on whether you are required to report, and the city will reach out to you to seek those reporting requirements. So this again, related to local preference, we you are not allowed to give them a advantage, right? But that we're trying to seek that all people can have an opportunity to be in the competition. Bonding requirements. So this is going to apply for construction or facility improvement contracts that exceed that simplified acquisition threshold, currently 250,000. The vast majority of you are not going to have to worry about insurance and bonding beyond the general insurance and bonding requirements of your organization and of the grant agreement. But for very large procurements over that simplified acquisition threshold, you are required to protect the federal interest by meeting certain minimum federal requirements of bid guarantees, performance bonds, and payments bonds. What I will just say is that you should reach out to the city before you engage in any kind of purchase over 250,000, and we can talk through the different steps because this is going to be limited to only a few people each year. Now, when we talk about procurement policies and procedures, one of those is going to be your conflict of interest policy. You should have a conflict of interest policy generally for your organization that addresses conflicts of interest that can arise from the grant funding and your work. And then more specifically to do with procurement, you need to make sure that your conflict of interest policy addresses that you cannot solicit or accept gifts or favors from contractors, that you cannot award contracts to a firm where any of the following people have an interest, whether a financial interest or other kind of interest. So you can't award a contract to a firm where your employees, your officers, or your agents, or any member of their immediate family or partner is employed, right, or has an interest, or any organization that is about to employ them, right? And you need to make sure that the conflict of interest policy isn't just a policy that sits on your books, but that you have trainings on it and that you periodically update it and make sure that all employees are familiar with it. So, as I said, the conflict of interest policy is one component of your general procurement policies and procedures. In addition to conflict of interest, you need to have in your policies and procedures clarification on who has approval authority for purchases. This also intersects with the kind of internal controls that are part of your financial management system. What information is required when receiving a price or rate quote, how goods and services will be procured. As I mentioned before, the Section 3 and women and minority owned business affirmative outreach, and then also those debarment checks. So, and then if you have, these procurement steps of these procurement thresholds and the methods that you can use, those should obviously be a part of your policies and procedures to give that clarification. Finally, records maintenance. As we said before, just err on the side of keeping it. Your procurement records, though, should include beyond obviously the records of your policies and procedures, your conflict of interests. If you have a vendors list and the system that you were able to recruit and create that vendors list. You should also have files on the rationale for selecting the method of procurement used for each individual purchase, the contracts or proposals, the debarment checks, the insurance and bonding as applicable, the contractor selection or rejection process, the basis for the cost or price of a contract, and of course, any receipts from purchases, proof of comparison shopping, quote shopping, all of that needs to be had because ultimately, if you don't document, it did not happen. Right? This is the case for virtually everything that you're going to do with these funds. If you do not document what you do, just saying that you did it does not count. So in all cases, just document, document, document. And that is our general overview, kind of a quicker overview of procurement. So I know that that's covering a lot of different things. So we wanted to open it up. If there is anybody that had any questions, they can put it in the chat. Um, Obviously, if you have any questions or comments that you don't want to do through this presentation or that you think of later, we highly encourage you to contact us. You can always email us at cpedcompliance@kalamazoocity.org. You can reach out to Alex or I personally or any of the staff at the cities. We're happy to discuss in more detail. And if you are a subrecipient now or in the future, we would always be happy to discuss these things, especially prior to doing the procurement, because it's always easier to make sure that we're all on the same page before any sort of purchase happens. So I'll give it a few minutes to see, or just a couple minutes to see if anybody has any questions.
Brett Huckabee asked, I'm wondering about forms or packet for subcontractor approval. Are there particular forms or anything you guys provide?
I am going to, we don't have anything set up. I do think that it'd be great. I might try reaching out to some of our current subrecipients who I know have procedures in place to see if they'd be willing to share some of those as kind of best practices and in the interest of helping others. Um, it's there, we could certainly help you sort of figure out a checklist and kind of go over it as you develop procedures. Um, but that's actually a really great idea. And I'm going to write myself a note now to make sure to reach out and then we can kind of see about developing a resource like that. We have community homework. Okay, Brett, you're saying we have community homeworks version, but no info on orientation packet like we used to do. I'm not sure what you're referring to. You able to? I'm not sure what you're referring to for the orientation packet. Oh, like the city's packet? Okay,
City.
we can see, yeah, so you're saying the city used to require an orientation for each sub. Yeah, so that's still, there's an orientation um, for all subrecipients, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody that's receiving a grant, you'll come to a mandatory subrecipient training. Um,
Yeah, in previous years, that wasn't something we had provided in this orientation, so that might be something I mean, as Ellie said, she took note of it. That could be something we provide in future
mhm.
subrecipient orientations.
I will say actually, Brett, I didn't know that you're with the community homeworks. That when I will give community homeworks a shout out, as I know that you guys do a great job generally of having some of those. I know you have a subcontractor packet, and so I was thinking of reaching out to you to see, what materials you already have in place that we could potentially look at sharing. Oh, okay. Okay. Brett has
All
clarified
right.
he's with senior services. We used to work there. But all right. So great subrecipients. So we can see what we can develop, um,
hmm
and how we can help kind of spread the best practices, and whether subrecipients are willing to share some of those, and what we can help develop as a city, to get everybody started a good place.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Brett. All right. Any final questions? All right. With that, thank you so much for attending this HUD Grant Fundamentals. Thank you, Maddie. We'll see you all next month for the environmental review module, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.